the first question that we've got that's appeared in the chat is, do we need to demonstrate love before we can hope to grow faith and bring hope?
So do we need to demonstrate love before we can bring, yes, okay. Right. Anybody want to have a go at that one? Any volunteers from the panelists?
I
Bishop Gregory
would say something, but I'll wait for Bishop Gregory to answer and then I'll follow up if I may.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, Gemma, I don't mean to pinch your thunder in any way. But you know what I think I heard from both our speakers today is the importance of starting with your own inner journey. You know, Jesus called on us to love our neighbours. How? As we love ourselves. And I think a very wise person once said, unless we love ourselves, then we cannot begin to love other people. And I heard that reflected in both what Richard and Gemma had to say to us. And so I don't want to put a priority on these three qualities: faith, hope, and love. Paul tells us that the greatest is love. So there's some truth in its priority in that sense. But I think we have to encounter God for ourselves. We have to exercise faith in order to be touched by hope and love for others. You know, herein is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us. And we love other people because God first loved us. We must be accessors of that love before we do anything else. And that's the exercise of faith.
Bishop Gregory, thank you. Sister Gemma, would you like to?
Thank you. I was just remembering something I read, and I'm afraid it's one of those kind of gnomic sayings, and I can't remember who it was that said it, but that people will often forget what you say, but they will always remember how you make them feel. And if we can help people to feel loved, and I think we need to remember that sadly, for many young people, we and people like us, some of their school teachers, may be the only safe adults that they know. And maybe the only people who really demonstrate to them what unpossessive, unselfish love is like. And that communicates so much more than any amount of erudition and eloquence. I'm in the business of erudition and eloquence, so I don't dismiss them as being unhelpful or unimportant. But ultimately, I do think that our first port of call in any kind of ministry is to be able to communicate to people that they are loved. And we will never communicate that if we have not had it communicated to us in the first place and have not experienced that love of God. So I'm back to also what Bishop Gregory said, but people will often forget what we say and they will forget what we do, but they will not forget how we make them feel.
Thank you. Right.
Shall I just say something on love? Because
yes, of course,
it's quite important. Yes, I mean, absolutely. I think love is, I mean, Paul is very clear here that love is preeminent. Love is tough. And love should not be confused with marshmallows. And I think it sometimes is. And, you know, having spent most of my life working with young people, I've had to be very tough with them. I do not believe the current psychological counseling, unconditional positive regard stuff. We cannot have unconditional positive regard. There are things that damage people and there are things that enhance people's human, wonderful lives. And we need to work to the latter, not the former. And, you know, one of my favorite head teachers is Cathal Birble-Singh at Michaela Community School in Brent, and she is often described as the strictest head teacher in England. Well, actually, she's the most loving head teacher in England, because she loves children and wants the best for them. And when we want the best for people, we sometimes have to be tough with them. And I think God has to be tough with us as well. There are limits to our behaviors. So absolutely love, but that's not just a sweet feeling. That's wanting the best for people. And I think we really need to hang on to that. And I don't think actually as Christians we do that enough.
Thank you very much. I think Tracy's going to read another question for us from the chat. It's from Jenny, I believe.
Yeah, thank you people for putting things into the chat for the panel. So this question is, how can we engage with people where they are in a way which shares these messages today?
Anybody want to have a go at that one?
I mean, I'm happy to, yeah.
Please do.
Okay. Yes, I think we need to explain the Christian faith, and this is where my knowledge thing I want to re-emphasize. We need to explain why Jesus had to die and why he had to become incarnate. And I think it's in that order, because that's the order in which it happened, and in which Christianity has always understood it. So why did he have to die? And there are all these explanations about, substitutionary atonement theory and stuff like that. When I was a head teacher, we abolished all behavior systems in the school and introduced restorative justice, which is a kind of negotiative process, but in which there is always a consequence, and in which if there was not a consequence, it never worked. And I thought that was really interesting. And I think that's a bit how the universe works. So it's not that God is angry with the human race and therefore needs to be paid a price, but that somehow, and I don't exactly understand how it works, that if we do bad stuff, there is a consequence to that has to be paid. Isn't a good word, but I can't think of a better one. And I think that's what Jesus had to do. And the incarnation, therefore, is necessary, because if he was not human as fully as we are, into being consubstantiality, it makes no difference to our humanity. And I think it's that difference making. So our humanity is changed fundamentally forever by Jesus dying and rising, and by our baptism, our entry into that. And I think it's those two things which are really essential. And they're quite difficult to explain, but I think if we can't explain them, we're going to find it really hard to convince people to be Christians.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you. So are you happy to move on to the next question?
Yes, the next question is from Reverend Jane Coxall, and she says she loves the idea that the first thing we should learn from Jesus is to be fully human, warts and all, and that all our experiences needn't have a holy varnish. But sometimes, do we as a church try to put too much varnish on it?
Sister Gemma, do you want to have a go at that one?
I want to say yes, we do. And it has failed us. It hasn't worked. We also have tried very often, I think, to put too much varnish on ourselves. Now, I don't, I'm not a great believer. Every time I switch on Microsoft, I've got yet another, B-list movie star, revealing something. And usually the revelation is incredibly uninteresting. And I do wonder, actually they're not, if I may say so in all charity. But, for us, actually, sometimes I think as pastors or as disciples, in whatever way we operate within the church, to actually be honest about our own struggles in faith, or our own struggles to be good, or our own struggles to accept what Jesus says, that comes across as much more genuine, much more human. And a message, I remember years ago when I first became an RE teacher, walking down the corridor behind two 11-year-olds who didn't realize that I was behind them. And they'd just come out of a class of mine. And one of them said to the other, "Do you know what I like about her classes?" No one said no. "She never tells you there's an answer if there isn't one." And I have to say, that was the moment I thought, well, I got something right there at any rate, because even at 11 years old, they are old enough to accept that there are some questions to which there is no answer, or there is no satisfactory answer this side of the grave. And therefore, to actually engage people with the unanswerable questions or the struggles that we have, I think is so much more effective pastorally than giving them a terribly kind of glitzy, packaged prosperity gospel version of the message of Jesus, which doesn't actually take on board the vulnerability and the general kind of fractured nature of human life and human experience. It's much, much more effective when we're real with people, because Jesus was very real with people. And, human beings can only bear so much reality. But I think if we are on the side of reality rather than on the side of holy fiction, then we're doing well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You happy to move on to the next question? So
we have a question from Buzz Squires, and she says, "I agree with what Richard has said, but Muslims have a very easy way to explain their faith in the 5 pillars. Can you suggest an easy way to help people who can't access theology easily?"
So I don't know if Richard wants to answer this or whether Bishop Gregory wants to have a go at this one. Being quiet there, Father.
Okay, I'll have a go, Jason. I mean, I think, Jesus offered the summary of the commandments: to love your Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And that's one principle that I think is quite a straightforward summary of what Christianity is about. Learning to know God and allowing God to transform your life, and then using that transformation in the service of humanity. I was thinking about Jane's question about varnish, and I think sometimes we varnish ourselves to appear as if we live a set of values which are not real, and the reality must come from the lived experience of discipleship, that if we love God and that will enable us to love our neighbor, that shall be the whole of the law, said Jesus. So that's the summary I'm going to go for.
Thank you. Richard, did you want to add anything to that? Are you happy to?
Well, I wouldn't be happy to add anything to Jesus.
I mean,
but I suppose one of the things I think we need to do is be less abstract and more concrete. And, again, particularly with children and young people. But, this is about what you do more than anything else, and how will you craft your life in a way that reflects exactly what Bishop Gregory has just said. So when you come to an actual choice of how you live your life, what difference will that make to that? And so I'm constantly trying to, get people to be more concrete and less abstract. And I think in spiritual direction, in our each of our own lives, that's what we should try and do, And it's from the fundamental stuff about the conservation of the planet to the relationship stuff that is profound for all of us. How do we make concrete choices based on all of this? That's what I want to come back to.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. You happy to move on to our next question? So it's from Stephen Smith.
Yes, the next question is, do we have a problem in that too many people have done church, and how do we tackle that?
Gemma, you look like you've got your thinking face on.
You know, again, I think it's not only that people have done church, people have done prayers, people have done hymn singing and all of that, and that has to come. And I think, you know, for all of us who have accepted a life of faith as adults, there has come a moment where we've moved from something that has been given to us by our parents, our schools, our pastors, whoever, to something that we have experienced and accepted for ourselves. And therefore, you know, I meet so many people who have a kind of notional assent to the whole Christian package, but who have never met Jesus. Putting it very simply, they've never had a personal encounter with the person in whom they say they believe. So it's a bit like believing in a theory. It's out there somewhere in the stratosphere, but it's not come home. And so anything we can do, which is why I go around the world peddling the Ignatian tradition of spirituality, because I think Ignatius was absolutely 100% sold on personal, intimate experience of Jesus as a human being and as a God who can be encountered and with whom those encounters are life-changing. I think anything that we can do to help people to experience God in Christ as a personal encounter, we shift then from doing church to being a disciple and being a friend of someone who becomes more real to us than we are to ourselves. And, you know, once you've made that step, you can never go back. You can never unexperience that. And it makes all the difference. And certainly my many years in prison ministry taught me that, because that's to a large extent what we were trying to do with our prisoners. And that was at the heart of the real conversion of many of them, you know, who had kind of residual memories from Sunday school or from their catechism classes or from what their granny taught them, but who'd never had you know, an experience of actually being encountered and loved by Jesus.
Thank you. So you happy to move on to the next question, if we could. So that's from Dylan.
Yeah, so this question is, what place does having a community to which we belong, or creating those communities with people who keep us accountable and keep us going with encouragement, have in doing all of this? So this is about community for support and encouragement.
Right. Bishop Gregory, do you want to?
I noticed that Dylan in his question talks about asking a nun and the founder of a priestly society.
But we have a bishop present, Father.
But that's fine. Do you know, I need the community of Christians around me, and I need the community of Christians around me because when I am down, they can give me encouragement. When I am filled with doubt, they share stories of faith. When I am inclined to despair about the life of the church, I discover new expressions of faith, which bring me hope about the future. Being a Christian on one's own relies so much on you being able to fuel your own journey of discipleship. And whilst I'd encourage people, of course, to be fueling their own journey of discipleship in terms of their prayer and their Bible study and their personal disciplines, it's quite hard to keep it going if you're doing it on your own. Whereas if you've got those around you who are encouraging you by example, teaching you things by simple or even sophisticated lessons that they've learned, then that becomes a far more creative thing. There was a preacher once who went to visit someone who'd stopped going to church, and they were trying to persuade them to go back. And they used all sorts of arguments as they sat by the fire in the house of the parishioner. And eventually they fell into silence. And as they sat there silently, one of the coals fell out of the fire, and they watched it go grey and cold because it was isolated from the fire where the coals generated heat together. And the lesson was learned.
Thank you, Father. We've got a couple of other questions.
Yeah. Thank you,
Dan,
Jason. The next question is from Dean Nigel, and it's, how can the church gain credibility in a secular society?
I think every time I have seen the church gain credibility, it's when we are seen to put our money where our mouth is. You know, I had the immense privilege of living and working as a missionary in Brazil, and the bishops and archbishops who were held quite rightly, I think, to be saints by the people were the ones who were not afraid to roll up their sleeves and get down and dirty and mucky with the poorest of the poor. And, you know, I saw some extraordinary things in my time there, particularly when I was in Sao Paulo working with Cardinal Arns, who, you know, he had no sense whatsoever of his own magnificence or dignity. He was a little man, all kind of wizened and wrinkled, a little bit like a monkey. And he was just gorgeous and loved the people, and the people knew it, and they loved him back. And, you know, he thought nothing of doing incredibly simple services for people. And I think, you know, people know when we're for real. And I think when the church comes alongside people, not as kind of the Lady Bountiful or as, you know, noblesse oblige, but actually steps into the reality of other people's lives and, you know, smells the smell of it and touches the harshness of it and experiences the cold and the lack of comfort and the loneliness of it. When we step into that space willingly alongside people, then they begin to learn to trust us. But I think if we're constantly, you know, preaching about poverty or about care for the earth or anything else, and are seen to live a life that is not consistent with that ourselves, then we might as well forget it, because people are not fools. You know, children are not fools. I mean, I knew that very early on as a school teacher. You cannot fool kids. And actually, you can't fool ordinary people either. They know when we're for real and when we're not. And that's the bottom line to me.
Thank you. Thank you. Happy to move on to the next one. We've got some more questions coming in.
Yes, we've got one that's coming by text, Jason, from Hannah.
Mm-hmm.
In a busy world which never stops, how do we take time for ourselves without feeling we are letting others down?
Father Richard,
I
you've
think
been
this is
quiet, so would you like to? Sorry.
I think this is really important, and there is a kind of Christian guilt, isn't there, about looking after ourselves, and a Christian guilt about self-care, and a Christian guilt about the natural rhythms of life. I think one of the key things, I work with a lot of clergy on their patterns of work, is managing the diary, being in control in the diary of the diary, and absolutely prioritizing prayer, stillness, silence, study, preparation for preaching. You know, and I think there's a real issue for us. And it relates to some of the previous questions about credibility, actually. There are real questions for us about pastoral care. You know, in any parish, in any ministry area, there is going to be a bottomless pit of need that no priest, no lay minister no person can meet. That is the nature of the universe. That is the nature of the world. And any priest, minister, pastor who thinks they can will be absolutely swallowed up and destroyed by that. So the key things for clergy are prayer, silence, study, all of those sorts of things. Those are the first priority, and they have to be in the diary before anything else. You've got to put in your diary your study day, your times for silence, your retreats, your quiet days, and you've got to be 100%. I cannot do whatever you ask me on this day because I am not available. And I cannot stress that strongly enough. Unless you do that, you will be destroyed by this bottomless pit of need. And then you can minister and pastor to some extent, because you've fed yourself and you've allowed yourself to do all of this. So get these priorities right. I mean, I have my retreat booked in 2024, because if I don't, it won't happen.
Thank you. Bishop Gregory, you wanted to come in just to alert people to the fact that Sister Gemma has also added something into the chat there. Bishop Gregory.
Yeah, I mean, for lay people, I think, we've got to remember the 10 Commandments. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, and on the 7th you shall rest. Now, the weekend has become a time of busyness for many of us, I think, in the modern world, a time when we try to address all those family agendas that we haven't been able to address in the week. When shops started opening on a Sunday, something I was not against, actually, there was the Keep Sunday Special campaign. And perhaps they had done something, and that perhaps we should try and say, as Christians, we will run Sundays differently. Yes, we'll find time for the family if we need to. Yes, the list of chores is there and needs addressing. But the first thing we'll put in place on a Sunday is some time for God. And that may be our worship in church. That may be a time of private prayer and silence. But at least one day in 7 to try and run the priorities in a way which puts faith forward. I'd also want to say that my spiritual director tells me it's worthwhile finding a point in the day when you set the timer, be it for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, start with 10 if it's not your discipline, increase it by 10 minutes if it is your discipline, and you set the timer and sit quietly and just wait for God to speak to you. And it doesn't really matter if nothing happens in that 10 minutes, but at least you've given God the space to be able to get hold of you.
Thank you very much. Words of wisdom. And thanks, Father. Just time for one really quick last question. Yeah.
Thank you, Jason. Yes, and this comes from Reverend Dominic Cordell in Estuary Mountain Mission Area. And he says that they discovered the power of bringing people to personal encounter with Jesus, particularly in the Eucharist. But many in the established congregation have never experienced this. How do we move people to personal encounter with Jesus, especially when they seem to have had just enough Christianity to inoculate them to real faith?
I'm happy to go if nobody else is.
Sorry. Quickly, yes, yeah. Richard,
shall I go?
Sorry, yeah.
I think the encounter with Jesus in the Eucharist is fundamental. If there were two things which were able to say were fundamental to Christian prayer, it was psalmody, the book of Psalms, praying those constantly, day by day, and the Eucharist, because that's what Jesus told us to do. And I think meeting him in the Eucharist is physical and bodily, and I think that's really important. And I think adoration of the Eucharist is really important as well. So providing silence in the Eucharist, in the Mass, is so important. I mean, I've done this thing for years now, in which every time which I'm at a Eucharist in which a priest says, you know, we'll now have a few moments silence, I count the number of breaths which I can breathe in that silence, and I have never ever got beyond 3. And at Thésée, where young people love praying and worshipping, the silence lasts 10 to 12 minutes 3 times a day in their services. We have got to give people the opportunity to experience silence with Jesus and the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. And if we don't do that, they will never meet him. And I absolutely think that's fundamental. When I'm with people I love, we have moments of silence and they last more than 3 breaths, I can tell you. So I think we need to build in silence and stillness and physical presence. The real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist is not an issue. The real presence of human beings with Jesus is the real issue.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Sister Gemma, do you want, you were about to leap in when somebody got in front of you.
I was indeed, like the fellow in the Gospels in the pool, you know, but he got there in the end, so like me. I also think that if we can help people imaginatively through the scriptures, through the stories of the Gospels, to meet Jesus as he touches people's lives, then the Jesus who touches our life in the Eucharist becomes more real. But equally, I would say that if we cannot help people to actually be Eucharist for others themselves, be bread for others themselves, then we've only told half the story. And I think part of the difficulty is when there's been a kind of disconnect with what we receive in the Eucharist and what we then enact. And it's when people actually discover that not only is the body of Jesus available to them in the Eucharist in what they receive, but the body of Jesus is available to them in those whom they touch, in those whom they see, in those whom they serve. Then we've actually brought the circle round to its full extent, and people get it. They get what it means to be Eucharist as well as to receive Eucharist. And those are both, I think, essential. Do this in memory of me, you know, is the command that Jesus gives at the Eucharist. And he shows how that is to be enacted by washing the feet of his disciples. So it's a two-way thing to me. And I think when we haven't helped people to make the fullness of that equation, they've only got half the story. And that's why they just kind of eventually walk away.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks to all the panel members, Bishop Gregory, Sister Gemma, to Father Richard as well. Thank you. Thank you to you all.